Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, Human Maid Carried the Injured Alien Emperor to Safety. Unaware whole galaxy was watching live HFY. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The night above Asterion's capital was a velvet ocean perforated by gold, and in that serene hour the palace floors still held the warmth of day in their glass-veined stone. The human maid moved along the corridor the way a breath moves along a sleeping chest, soft, unremarkable, nearly invisible. She had a tray balanced on one palm and a cloth tucked into the waistband of her gray dress, and the flowers on the tray, fragile bell lilies imported from a world she would never see, trembled with her steps. Her name was Mara Keene. She had come to Asterion not as an emissary or a soldier, not as some chosen one filigreed with prophecy, but because debts had teeth and the palace posted help wanted to the refugee enclaves on the outer rings. She was short, sinewed from a lifetime of lifting more than she thought she could, and her hair was tied back with a strip torn from an old uniform jacket, the only cloth in her possession that still felt like hers. The palace was alive with small noises, the hush of air over chimes, the distant drip of a fountain coiled through corridors like veins, the whisper of attendants' feet. Asterion's splendor was designed to be quiet, as if power needed nothing louder than a sigh to be believed. Tonight, however, the silence felt like a held breath, and the windows framed a sky too wide, too dark, as if something out there had drawn the stars into an attentive stillness. Mara did not look up. She counted her heartbeats and timed her breath with her steps, focusing so she wouldn't think of her brother down on the docks, his lungs belabored by the dust storms kicked up by the orbital cannons when freighters broke atmosphere. She focused so she wouldn't think of the rumors that crawled through the kitchens like rats, that the Emperor had refused a treaty, that pirates were no longer pirates but something sharper, unified, that the palace's heart would beat louder before the week was over. She turned a corner and almost collided with a flotilla of drones carrying a translucent pod of sleeping animals, two pale fawn things with leaf-shaped ears and legs like spun glass. They blinked at her as they went by, their hooves tapping the pod's surface, and Mara paused to let them pass. The corridor widened, a rectangular artery ending at the throne room vestibule, and she felt the edge of a breeze as a door ahead let in the cold scent of night. A figure stood in the vestibule. It was tall, wrapped in a mantle that held starlight and returned it sharpened. The crown was not a circle here but a living mantle of light that crawled and reformed with every breath the wearer took. The Empire of Asterion had chosen to make its icon a biology of luminescence. It was said their emperor, like all before him, wore a diadem grown from seeding lights in the bone, carrying the rule in marrow, not on brow. Mara did not stare. It was etiquette drilled into every servant from first day. The emperor is not to be looked at unless spoken to, not because he feared eyes, but because he deserved more than hunger's stare. She kept her head lowered and would have sketched a bow if a sudden tremor hadn't shuddered through the floors, a deep cough of stone that made the bell lilies shiver from their stems. The emperor's bodyguards spun in perfect synchronization. Their armor shifted from iridescent ornament to matte combat gray, and the air around them thickened as drones deployed. Somewhere a siren started. It was not loud, it was the kind of sound you feel more than hear, a vibration in the throat like the beginning of a scream. Mara's tray tilted, flowers scattered. The tremor became a blow, lights flared, walls released the smell of old minerals and heat. Distantly, not from the sky but from inside the palace ribs, something hit, tore, burned. She saw a long hairline fracture race along the far wall like frost forming. The emperor turned, and for the first time Mara looked up. His face was finer featured than she had expected, the angles softened by something like fatigue. The crown light skated along his temples and down over his cheekbones like river water. His eyes, colorless in the strobing alarms, passed over her without emphasis and then beyond her, to somewhere far behind, through walls and beyond the horizon. He was listening to a chorus of voices she could not hear. Another blow, this one closer. He moved then, one hand lifting in command, and the mantle around his shoulders unfolded into a shield that blossomed like a glass flower. The palace shook again. From the windows, night erupted with spear points of light. For a breath, the world was a mosaic of incoming trajectories and upward stabbing defenses, and Mara's stomach recognized the shape of battle even if her mind did not yet grasp it. "Get down," one of the guards said. The voice was filtered and calm. Mara dropped. She was suddenly small in a river of armored legs and humming drones. The smell of ionized metal filled her mouth. In the instant of fear there came a memory, vivid without context. Her mother's voice on a mining platform far beyond the lanes on a world whose dust still lived in her hair, saying, "When stone breaks, don't run, love. Find the load bearing and go where it goes." She looked to the emperor, not as a sovereign, not as a symbol, but as a weight in the structure whom the entire palace had been engineered to hold. The load bearing. Through the vestibule doors, racing in the corridor, a shape cut past, shadow within shadow like night folded over night. No alarm had the texture of that. The guards' weapons flickered up. 3 shots cracked the air soundless, turned into light, and died. The shadow rippled and became a person made of absence, blade lights flicking along wrists. A bodyguard fell soundlessly, armor bleeding brightness. The emperor took one involuntary step in front of Mara and another behind his shield. The shadow person moved with economy born of long practice, their blades saying nothing, their face masked in a sheen that reflected only a smear of the room. Mara crawled, hands burning on hot floor. She saw the thing the intruder didn't. The ceiling here had decorative ribs like the inside of a shell. Each rib had a seam, each seam had a maintenance hatch. Behind one of those hatches, she'd found it on her hands and knees scrubbing. The palace's old bones were misaligned. Warped from an accident no one had written up, because who writes up bones that still hold? That warp created a protrusion, a little tooth she'd cut her palm on once. The shadow person pivoted, stepping exactly beneath the strain hatching. Mara reached for a broken bell lily stem, anything, found only her hands. She moved without thinking, and in that moment 2 lives, hers and the intruder's, synchronized. She lunged, hooked her fingers in the seam, and yanked. Something gave. The hatch buckled, the rib flexed, and the little tooth slid. The ceiling groaned like an animal. A shard of decorative cladding broke and fell. It was not a weapon, it was not heavy, it simply distracted. The intruder glanced up, barely, and a guard's shot took the shadow in the knee. The intruder staggered, collided with a pillar, and in one smooth, embodied curse threw a palm full of micro-needles toward the emperor. The shield took most. One needle hissed through, it struck flesh. Everything froze in a crystalline instant. The emperor's hand went to his side with a sound like a man dropping a glass in a sink. The needle head was black. The crown light flared and guttered. The room erupted. Guards moved. The shadow person fled into smoke. The air filled with protective drones, and Mara's throat said, "No." She did not know she said it aloud. She saw the emperor sway. Their eyes met. She did not see a man or an alien or a crown, but a body dealing with a wound, breath in a chest and blood flowing from an inside place to an outside place, the border violated. She saw someone about to fall in a manner that did not suit the physics of the moment. She rose into a storm of orders. She moved the way you move when the roof of a mine collapses, fast enough to outrun dust, slow enough to find the breathing pocket. She went to him. The guards didn't see her through the noise. The emperor did. When she put her hands under his arm, his weight was warmer than she expected. His mantle shuddered around her forearms. Up close, the crown light smelled like ozone and snow. "Wait," he said or thought, and maybe he didn't, because his eyes were a watercolor of gray, inked with pain. He attempted to stand on his own and failed. The needle had turned the skin at his side an ugly purple. She would think later how odd it was that an emperor could be undone by a needle when in stories it takes spears and knives and prophecies. But toxicity is democratic. It will drag a god down to the floor just as surely as a worker. Mara wrapped his arm over her shoulders and pulled. She was not tall, but she was practiced in moving dead weight. Men in the camps drank and fell. Oxygen tanks failed. Miners were trapped. You learned leverage or you lost somebody. She bent, hooked her hip under his center of gravity, and moved. All at once the guards saw her and shouted words that sounded like "stop" and "identify," and "where are you taking?" A blast cracked the corridor behind them, shattering a window into self-illuminating shards. The palace vomited drones like bees from hives. A voice came from the air itself. An old voice, stretched across a dozen languages to reach everyone and none, broadcasting on every channel. Unbeknownst to Mara, 1,000 cameras had just awakened across the planet, and 1,000 cameras watching 1,000 channels in 1,000 homes and ships and war rooms all switched as one to a single feed. The Emperor wounded, a tiny human helping him stand. Without warning, the galaxy pivoted its gaze and fell into the palace like rain down a well. Mara didn't know. She was standing between a sovereign and a hole in the world. She was also a maid who'd mapped the palace out in tired steps. There was a service corridor ahead that did not appear on public schematics. There was a hatch she could lift with her elbow and a maintenance rail that led down behind the walls like an artery. She prioritized. Keep him breathing, keep him moving, find the load bearing. She pulled him through the hatch that recognized the Emperor and buzzed for his biometrics, but accepted them even while his crown flickered, because old systems are loyal in the small ways. They fell into darkness. The rail hummed under their boots. The space was cramped, warmer, filled with an iron smell and whisper of transport veins pushing nutrient fog to the palace gardens. The Emperor hissed as his side struck the rail. He stumbled again, and she took more of his weight. He was swaying now, the crown light flickering like a candle in a paper lantern when the lantern runs low on oil. "Sir," she said without thinking, because the word was what she had for him and words matter. "Breathe with me. Not bio codes or full names or chorus titles. Just that." She filled her chest and made her ribs wide and counted aloud like she used to do for her brother on the nights the dust storms made his lungs forget what to do. In 2, 3, hold. Out 2, 3, 4. She felt the Emperor's chest answer like someone struggling to remember the lyrics to a song he used to know. She kept walking. Her shoulder burned. His blood soaked the gray of her dress dark. Above and around them the palace fought like a creature under dissection. External batteries pulsed. The storm of enemy craft, the ones who had come through the old mine lanes, riding the dust of old wars, wearing the bones of pirate banners but carrying the discipline of something new, wove in and out of defense nets. Their leader's voice, the old many-languaged one, continued to broadcast, tuned to fear. He spoke of tyranny and theft and human pets. He spoke in a tone designed to widen old wounds. Half the galaxy listened. The other half watched. Children with dinner halfway to their mouths stared as feeds overlaid the palace schematics on their plates. Soldiers at their stations saw targeting reticles converge on a single point and then dissolve because the targets were inside. Old wives pulled blankets to their chins and whispered the names of extinct gods, because this was what it felt like when empires turn. Traders paused mid-deal. Miners took hands off drills and looked up as if they could see the palace through the rock. All of them saw, now or later, the flicker of a small human figure under the arm of a mantle-lit sovereign, disappearing into service guts, pursued by a cartoonish runner of red dots representing enemy teams. "Security," said a voice in the maintenance channel, too calm. "He is in the south wall. He is with a human female. Intercept." Mara tightened her hand at the Emperor's waist. He was losing coherence. Even his sweat had a different smell now, a chemical sourness. He was heavy, heavier than his height and slender build should have made him, as if his bones held more than calcium. She could not let him stop. She remembered the old miner in the camp who used to call her Mouse. He told her once, if a collapse happens you count steps. Don't think of the whole tunnel. Count 12 steps at a time. There's air at 13. She counted now. She counted for both of them. Left, she muttered, turning down a notch of hallway that led not to the throne's vault but toward the kitchens, and then past, into the stone at the back of the scullery, where the palace older than the palace still lived, stairwells carved by hands that didn't know starships existed. She'd found them once when she'd been lost and had slept there, tucked between two columns that smelled of mineral dreams, and in the morning no one had noticed she'd vanished. The Emperor's fingers tightened on her shoulder, not in resistance but in gratitude. It felt like a human gesture and a not human one at the same time, the weight of presence, bones asking bones to keep going. He tried to speak. A sound came that might have been a word in the palace tongue or only a breath nudged toward meaning. She did not ask him to repeat it. Questions are for safety. They had none. Behind them came the sound of boots. Enemy boots, their rhythm more aggressive, their heels striking like an argument repeated too often. Mara shoved the hatch closed behind them. She knew the latch was broken. She also knew if you wedged a piece of metal into the hinge and leaned the right way, it would hold. She used the flat of her hand, set her foot, and shoved. The hinge bit. She leaned until her breath was heat, and with a tiny, holy click the misfit hinge set. Not for long, but long enough. She led the Emperor down stone steps that pulsed with the heart of the mountain. He left a smear of blood on the wall. She stopped and took off her apron, the gray scrap that was neither pretty nor cheap, and wadded it against the wound. He startled at the pressure, a small flinch that revealed how close to the edges he'd come. The crown light guttered dangerously, then caught again, small as a prayer. Good. She murmured to him to her own hands. Good. She remembered that in another life men in coats had taught her to apply pressure, and to listen for breathing and to say calming things even if you were not calm. She had never been officially certified because official costs more money than patience, but some things don't need stamps to be true. They reached the old scullery. The air changed. It smelled of thyme and salt and a faint sweetness from the stories enslaved cooks used to whisper when they were not allowed to speak. The thick columns held up a ceiling low enough to make the Emperor bow his head. Darkness lay like another layer of stone. There's a way out here, Mara thought. Not an exit, an artery. She had mapped it in her boredom and fear. Behind the scullery, a forgotten door led to a hall that ran parallel to the outer courtyard and then dove, almost a straight line, toward the hydro mines beneath the palace. The hydro mines were where the palace got its water and its clean air, and there were safe rooms there for engineers and cleaning crews and anyone unlucky enough to be below ground when a storm or war pinned them down. Some safe rooms were safe from bombs. Some were safe from being found. She knew which kind. The boots were closer. She could hear breath, laughter, the scrape of a weapon's butt against a frame. The Emperor's knee buckled. He sank to one hand against a column. The crown light flickered and spat. The mantle over his shoulders trembled as if trying to shiver itself alive. He whispered something, this time in a language Mara knew only from lullabies traded in camps between women who had no lullabies left of their own. Don't leave. I won't, she said. Come on, one hand on the wall, wait on me, we go now. She propelled him through the door and into the hall. They were almost running, a long broken stumble. His bare footfalls sounded different than hers, softer, a whisper on stone. She noted that fact the way a mind notes a fact without caring. The hall ended at the stairwell that would take them down fast, and she nearly sobbed with relief at the sight of it. Behind them the scullery door slid open. The hinge gave. The boots poured in. A flashlight's white sheet ran along the hall floor like spilled milk. Voices called, and the cadence of their words had the not quite synchronous rhythm of men who learned the language later than they learned to hate. Mara didn't look back. She pulled. The Emperor moved this time as if a part of him had detached from body. An instinct or a training or a faith stood up and walked forward even as the flesh lagged. It made the weight on her shoulders lighter for a stretch of stairs. They went down and down. The walls shed their polished skin and became stone that remembered tidefalls. The stairwell ended in a gateway that wore rust like a shawl. Beyond, tunnels laced like pathways in a leaf. The hydro mines. Once they had been a river trapped in rock, and now they were the palace's thirst answered. Mara paused, choices spread. Left would take them to the main plant. Right would rabbit warren through the oldest ducts. Straight would go to a promising black. The Emperor swayed and the choice made itself. She chose right, the path with the least human marks. Boots hammered down the stairs behind them. Somewhere, a shot cracked rock. The tunnel snapped it into echoes. "Do they see us?" Mara asked, which under the circumstances was a prayer. The Emperor's eyes unfocused and refocused like camera lenses grinding. He swallowed noise and turned the crown light with his will. It brightened by a fraction and cast shadows like long knives. "Yes," he breathed, and those were the first words he had said that were unambiguously human to her ear, but not clearly. "Good enough," she said, and guided him deeper. The tunnel tightened, ribbed with old mineral accretions. Water dripped with a tempo like a clock trying to remember how to proceed. Mara's shoulder throbbed. Her hands were sticky with someone else's blood. Behind them the boot noise grew fainter, grew louder, grew fainter again, a search engine trying to inherit the stone's logic and failing. She kept counting. 12 steps, air. 12 more, air. She leaned her weight into a door that groaned and then allowed them through. The safe room smelled of machinery, oil, and something medicinal. Its walls were lined with tanks that hummed in subsonic. There was a cot, a medkit that had expired 5 years ago, a water line that still vibrated with pressure. She lowered the Emperor onto the cot. The crown light dimmed alarmingly, then steadied at a candle's height. "Do not fall asleep," she said, and that was not etiquette but a survival law. She opened the medkit. Most of it had dried to powder or decayed to sugars. The injectors were old generation, one-time use. The antiseptic smelled like the ghost of a hospital. She tore her apron and pressed fresh cloth to his side. The wound had that perfume of chemical sabotage now, a scent with memory and malice. His hand flinched from hers and closed on the cot. "The needle," he said, "crafted to interrupt the mantle. It will seek me. Then we hide you from it," said, "from your own blood." He made a sound that could have been a laugh if it had energy. "Human logic," he whispered, and while it was not a compliment, it was a blessing. "What is your name, Mara? Your debt will be forgiven." "Don't say that," she said quickly like a superstition. "Not until it's done." He watched her with eyes that had seen births of stars and taxes collected, seen ships bleed in the dark, seen his own face reflected in 1,000 courtier cups. Now he saw a maid tear cloth with teeth. He saw her hands, crudely gentle. He saw her shoulder holding him up. He saw that nobody had ever promised her anything that wasn't already between her hands. "Very well," he said softly. "Not until it's done." The safe room lights quivered. The palace above shook as if the mountain had turned in its sleep. The world beyond the walls shouted through fabric and stone. The old broadcasting voice of the enemy cut through again, oily and ambitious. It told stories about empires and corruption and a human servant. The horror in the word was measured in the Emperor's arms. A dozen old hatreds woke and desired breakfast. But the feed also carried another story, one that grew beneath the voice they tried to force upon it. A small figure lifting a larger one, a human spine aligned with a duty not self-chosen and not self-applauded, and audiences like to choose the story that hurts less. Mara cleaned the wound. "The needle head's lodged near the rib," she murmured. "I can't see it, your blood has a shimmer. The mantle, it weaves parentage from the bone outward. The needle is unweaving. He bit down on the word as pain skittered across him. There is a way, there is a chamber where the mantle is stored when it is not worn. It can be reset, it can pull me back, but she said, where? Below the gardens, the chamber of night. It is sealed. It opens to me and to the keeper of bones. She is dead. He closed his eyes briefly around the idea of death. When he opened them again, pain had pared him into something precise. The chamber will open to me. It must, but I cannot walk that far. Mara looked at him. There was no calculation. She simply looked and saw that he was telling the truth. She stood, set her feet, and said, "Then I will carry you." He almost smiled. It was a terrible time to make something like a smile, but empires have fallen because someone chose to smile at a terrible time. "You are small," he said. "I am used to carrying more than I want to," she said, "and there is a way." He did not ask what way. He closed his eyes abruptly. The crown light trembled. Mara feared then, not for the emperor but for the part of her that had grown in the last hour to wrap around this duty. To keep going. She had let a rule grow: if he breathes, I move. If he moves, I breathe. If that rule broke, what would she do? "Stay awake," she ordered. She glanced around the safe room and saw the tanks. The tanks fed a circulation system, and the system fed a pipeline. Through a grate along a wall, a maintenance rail ran, this one not for feet but for carts that slid on magnetics. She followed it with her eyes. It ran through the wall at a patch she knew how to remove. Without thinking about why she had noticed that patch on a cleaning shift 3 months ago, she moved, pulled at the fasteners, and the plate came away. A corridor the width of a coffin lay beyond. A set of hooks held a maintenance sled. Mara's hands closed around the sled's handles. The sled had a coolant reservoir and a tether and a chemical pack. It was meant to bear crates full of carbon filters when engineers were too tired to carry them. It would bear a sovereign if asked correctly. She dragged it into the safe room and set it beside the cot. "Forgive me," she said to the emperor, a human to a king, and then slid her arms beneath him again. He gasped, his breath exploding against the inside of his clenched teeth, and the crown light flared once, reflecting off the sled's dull surface, making its metal into a brief miracle. She eased him onto the sled, hooked the tether over his chest to keep him from rolling off, and wedged her apron under his side so the strap would not grind his wound. "Pain," he whispered. "I know," she said. "Hold my hand." He looked at her as if this were a negotiation, then took her fingers. His hand was colder than it should have been. She was grateful for the pressure in her palm because it made him material. She clipped a chemical pack to the sled's base and cracked it. The sled hummed. It created a tiny pocket of reduced friction and heat, a thin octagon of field around itself. It could glide if the floor was smooth. The tunnels were not smooth, but the field would cheat physics a little. That was all she wanted. Above them the palace moaned. Below, water shifted in ancient channels. Mara took the sled's handles in both hands and leaned her weight forward. The sled moved reluctantly, then in a grudging glide. The emperor's breath changed. He was concentrating on silencing parts of himself that had begun to panic. She felt it through his fingers. "Tell me what you see," she said. "Tell me anything, it helps." "Your hand," he said after a small eternity. "It is rough. Apologies. Do not apologize." His head rolled and found the static line of the sled's surface as if a cool flat helped him. "It tells the truth about your life. I am not used to hands that tell the truth." She wasn't sure if that was confession or insult. She took it as neither. She leaned into the sled and counted again, the numbers a rhythm. The corridor tightened, widened, breathed. Behind walls, machinery clicked like old crickets. Writing in long dead paint flaked from the stone. She tasted underground wet old copper. The sled's hum was the only new sound in a place built only to have old sounds. Boots returned faintly, then louder. The enemy had found the old drawings. They had looked at the old drawings with new eyes. A shot snapped, splintering stone close enough that grit kissed her cheek. She did not turn, she did not deviate. The load-bearing, she thought, go where it goes. The tunnel chose an upward tilt that made the sled a stubborn child. Mara's thighs shook, sweat carved tracks down her neck. Once she stumbled and almost fell across the Emperor. He made a sound not of fear but of a man waking briefly from a nightmare to remind himself of where the walls are. His hand crushed hers. "Do not stop," he rasped. "I won't," she said. Her voice had become a stone in her throat. It felt like an oath, a primitive thing older than names. She pushed. The sled slid. The maintenance corridor opened briefly into a cavity where old machines lived like beasts at hibernation, their backs rising out of the dark. The air had volume here. It pushed back. Her steps echoed and returned swollen. For a heartbeat, she had the sensation of a stadium before dawn, the empty seats holding the memory of a crowd. It made the hair on her arms lift. She felt seen by a thing that could not see. The Emperor's head turned. His eyes tracked nothing. "They are watching," he said in a voice that had been sanded down to bare timber. "Who?" "The galaxy." Mara's foot hit a gap. She caught herself with a curse. She did not understand. "Let them," she said, and only afterward realized what she'd said and why it mattered. She was a maid who had spent most of her life making herself small, unseen, unrecorded. She pressed her shoulder to the world now and told it to move. If the galaxy watched, it could learn how the work is done. They reached a door painted with the sigil of the gardens, a spiral of leaves wrapped around a seed. On its other side, the chamber of night lay. If it would open, if the Emperor's crown light could command an automatism designed to obey only the healthy, if the enemy didn't kill them at the threshold. The boots were closer again. Voices echoed, and the words this time were clear. "There, the human, don't kill the human, use her." The words hit her back like thrown stones. The Emperor inhaled sharply. His hand tightened so hard she thought her fingers would go numb. She reached with her free hand and slapped the seal. The door blinked once, twice. "Identify," it said in the palace's woman voice, the one they all imprinted upon at arrival. The crown light flared. It did not flare much. It flared enough that the paint on the door's sigil lit from under, as if it had always been meant to do that but had been waiting for the right moment. "Emperor," he whispered, "open." The door considered. The boots grew nearer. "Open," he said again. There was a hollow under the word where sorrow should have been. He had to give commands with less of himself than he had used to give thanks. The door clicked. It slid. The space beyond was black in a way that contained stars. Mara pulled the sled through. The Chamber of Night was named for its dark, not for its purpose. But in truth both were one. It was a room built to house a mantle of light when it slept. The walls were etched with stories, crown genealogies, lines of inheritance that climbed like vines up stone. The ceiling arced into a dome pierced with holes that once had opened to the sky and now opened to carefully vaccinated air. And if you looked up, you might think you were falling into constellations, though in fact they were lights. The floor was smooth and cold. In the room's center, a shell of black glass rose from the floor, a cradle for a living crown. It wore a sheen like oil on water, and within it something glowed soft as the last coal in a sacred hearth. Mara guided the sled beside the cradle. She went to help the Emperor up and found she could not lift him alone. He felt heavier, not because he was, but because she was approaching the edge of her strength. He turned his head to look at the cradle. For a moment she thought he would cry, but he did not know how to do that here. Empires unspool their grief in private. "Help me," he said. "I am." "No." Looked at the cradle. "You will need the chorale. There is a song." The keeper sang it. It woke the crown and laid it down. "I can teach you a piece. The door will close behind us but not lock. They will come. You'll have to sing fast." She stared at him, then at the cradle. The memory of her mother's mining camp songs came back, the ones that kept time with drills, the ones that bent time so grief could fit into it. She took a breath that felt like a set of shelves settling. "Teach me." He did. The melody was simple if you listened with your bones, not your ears. It rose on the fourth and then fell as if stepping down carefully from a ladder. It had a word in it that meant both open and remember. He whispered it. She sounded it. Something in the cradle stirred. The boot stopped just beyond the door. She heard the slick hair sound of blades being set for use. The leader's voice, the one that had been broadcast into households and kitchens and cockpits, slipped through in a near whisper. "Wait, watch what she does." Mara ignored him. She sang. Her voice was not trained, but it was honest. The melody curled around the room like smoke and pressed its forehead to the cradle's shell. The shell lifted its face and breathed. Light swam within, a galaxy in a glass of water. She put her hand on the Emperor's chest. "Up," she told him, and he obeyed like a man walking onto a stage after hemorrhaging backstage, using muscle and command to move a body that had nearly forgotten the steps. She took his weight, slid him up onto the cradle's lip. The cradle accepted him with a sigh. The mantle light inside woke and reached for its owner with a hunger so delicate it felt like snowflakes landing. Behind them, weapons lifted as if they had been attached to her muscles. The leader was not speaking now. He, too, was watching. "Sing," the Emperor whispered. Mara sang. The melody lulled and unwound. Her voice found the old mining camp grit and bound itself to the palace lullaby like vines twisting. The crown light rose, flared, and pressed itself against the Emperor's ribs from inside, reweaving. It burned the poison where it found it. It licked the needle head and sucked it like a splinter from flesh, drawing it up and out. It used bone as scripture and blood as ink. The Emperor arched. His hand crushed hers. The crown flared once, twice, and then went impossibly bright. It lit the etched stories on the walls. It lit the invaders' faces at the door and turned them into masks and then into neighbors and then into children caught doing a wrong thing. At the end of the hall, the door slammed shut. It did lock this time. The leader swore. He slammed something heavy against the door. He was on the other side of the glass now. A frustration turned into a rehearsal. Mara kept singing. Her breath ran out. She found more. The cradle vibrated under the Emperor's body. He cried out once, a raw sound that flayed her and stitched her up in the same instant. Light cascaded over the cradle's rim and fell onto the floor like rain in a storm. It soaked up dust that had not existed and kissed her cheeks and wrists with a cold that felt like morning. The needle head rose. She saw it, black, screaming a frequency she couldn't hear, lift from his side and hang above the cradle like a terrible fruit. The crown light curled around it, strangled its song and broke it like an egg. Darkness leaked. The crown drank it. The Emperor's back arched again and then he went still. Silence fell except for her breathing and the far-off crash of a frustrated general. Mara's own voice shocked her into stillness by ceasing. She was a body made of throat. She stared at the Emperor's face. He was still. He was very still. She leaned in, heart rising like something that refuses to be in a chest. She bent her ear to his mouth like a child listening for the ocean in a shell. She felt a breeze. She felt it again, a breath, then two, three. The crown dimmed to hearth. The Emperor opened his eyes. They were not the color of water, but of light moving under ice. He looked at her for a long moment that held more years than either of them had lived and then said, "Mara." "Don't talk yet," she said quickly, because talking was loss of energy, but his saying her name had stitched something in her she had not known was torn. The door shook under a new assault, one that sounded like science rather than anger. Something sizzled, fretted, resumed. The leader had brought a tool. He would open this door as all doors open when men with tools decide they must. The Emperor sat up. He did it slowly, as if reorganizing himself molecule by molecule. When he pulled away from the cradle, the crown light slid back inside, not like a monarch reclaiming a throne, but like a lover returning home. It settled. It gleamed. It hummed a note Mara could not hear but could feel in her bones. The mantle over his shoulders refit his flesh and straightened his spine. He rolled his shoulders once and winced because healing is honest. It does not erase what happened, it gives you a way to carry it. "They will come in," Mara said, hoarse with tiredness. "We should leave the way we came." "No," he said. He stood, swaying, and then caught himself with a hand on the cradle. When he looked toward the door, the mantle light gathered along his shoulders like a storm considering a valley. He lifted his hands. "We end this here." Mara looked at him and thought of all the corridors left behind, the tunnels, the boots, the needle. She looked at the door where a shape of a weapon began to cut a rectangle like a hungry mouth through the metal. She wanted to say, "We are two." She wanted to say, "There is a drain here. The light runs out if you stand here too long." But she in fact said nothing, because in that moment her body knew what it had been doing since the bell lilies fell, bearing. She put her hand on the sled, grabbed its handles, and pulled it to the side. It made a minimal, essential clearing on the floor that made no historical sense but made all the sense to her. Give the Emperor room. The door fell inward with a beauty that only engineers appreciate. The leader of the invaders stepped through first because these men always do. He was taller than men tend to be and wore his cruelty in the set of his shoulders the way some men wear love. He took in the room, the cradle, the light, the human with hands blood-sticky and eyes too open, and the Emperor standing because he could. He smiled, not in mockery, in anticipation of a story he believed he wrote. "You have nowhere left to go," he said. "Give me your crown, kneel, and I will let that little human leave alive." Mara was surprised to hear her own voice, calm and a little tired, say, "You're very bad at reading rooms." The leader's eyes flicked to her with the casual cruelty of a man who has never shared a table with anyone who could break his teeth. "Hush," he said. The Emperor lifted his hand. It was a small gesture and did not carry enough light to be impressive, but it changed the temperature in the room. The leader's men shifted. The leader smiled wider. "Perform," he said. Here the story could have become one of those floods of power that wash rooms clean and teach fear to respect. This one did not. The Emperor did not throw bolts of sun. He did not turn the leader to salt. He walked forward, slow and careful, like a man with a new wound who refuses to walk like a wounded man. He stopped within the door's shadow. The leader lifted his weapon. He might have shot. The Emperor lifted his hand again, and the weapon's muzzle softened like wax. The leader looked at it in surprise that bordered on intimacy. The Emperor said in a voice that sounded like the stone had agreed to speak through him, "Leave." The leader laughed. He stepped forward. His shadow fell across the cradle. "No." The room waited. The crown light pooled. The Emperor was not strong enough to blast this man out through the door and into the palace and up into a story. He was strong enough to take one step closer to him. He was strong enough to do what kings rarely remember how to do. He lowered his hand. He looked at the leader with the rueful fondness you save for boys who have broken toys and now want to break the world. "Your voice spoke on all channels," he said. "You were careful with words. You spoke of injustice and wanted to harness it to your cart. Your hands do not know the weight they ask to pull." The leader lifted his chin. "You have kept humans as pets." "No," the Emperor said softly. "We have kept them as guests who pay rent in sweat, which is not the same shame but is shame enough. We will answer for it after this, not to you." The mantle brightened, not as a threat but as a mirror. "I will answer to her." He looked at Mara, and the camera that had found her followed his gaze like a child. The galaxy watched a human maid stand in a room with a king and a rebel, and realized the room had only one person who hadn't chosen that room. The leader's face did something he had not intended it to do, flickered with confusion, as if for a second the channel he watched had switched to another show. He set his jaw. "Die," he said, and lifted a second weapon. Mara began to move before she thought. She did not move toward the leader, she moved toward the cradle. The idea that arrived in her head came from an old miner's story about how the mantle is not a crown worn by a man, but a system designed to be worn by whoever carries the weight. It wants to live in the load-bearing. "Don't," the Emperor said, but not to her, to everything, to the moment. The leader fired. What happened next would be slowed and cut, looped and remixed, turned into 1,000 music videos and life lectures and sacrilegious parodies across a dozen cultures. There would be debates about whether it was human instinct or strategy, whether it was physics or providence. But inside it, at life speed, it felt like this. Mara lifted the sled's chemical pack and slammed it against the floor. The coolant field flared and distorted, bending light and pressure. The shot that should have gone straight for the Emperor's heart encountered a pocket of wrong and hesitated. The crown light in that instant surged, exertion like a muscle flexing. The shot struck the cradle instead and exploded into a fizz of photons. The leader stumbled, shocked. The Emperor took that stride forward he had saved for when it mattered. He took the leader's wrist in one hand. He put the other hand to the leader's throat, not to crush it, but to measure it. He leaned in. "The galaxy is watching," he said. "Then let it watch you die," the leader hissed, but beyond his eyes something trembled. His men had expected spectacle. They saw instead a king spare a man's life with a hand he could have used to remove it, spectacle of a different sort. "Leave," the Emperor said again, and this time the mantle voice hummed under his words. It was not an order with punishments attached. It was a permission to not ruin yourself today. Some men long for that permission without knowing they do. Some men don't. The leader wrenched his arm free, snarled, gathered himself for another strike, and the palace made its decision. The old systems, reading a chart of inputs, declared the invaders not kings but guests who had overstayed. The Guardian drones, held back from this room as if by etiquette, arrived like a final line of a poem. They did not blast, they pressed. They leaned bodies and shields and incentives. The leader looked around and saw a story that was no longer his and spit on the floor, because that is what you do when your mouth has nothing left. "Fall back," he barked. His men did. He moved last because these men always must. At the door he half-turned and threw a last thing, almost artfully. It was a blade that had done quiet work. It went toward Mara because the leader knew where pain ripples best. The Emperor did not try to catch it. He stepped physically between the blade and the maid and took it in his mantle. Light flared. Pain traveled from mantle to bone. He absorbed it like taxes. The blade fell hissing to the floor. For the first time, the leader looked at him and saw a man who would do a small, necessary thing rather than a large, necessary thing. He did not understand it. He left. Silence returned like a breath held too long. The mantle dimmed. The Emperor swayed once. Mara's hand shot out and steadied him. He grasped her arm near the elbow, fingers learning the size and shape of her as if committing them to a ledger. "You said you would carry me," he said, and his lips this time tried to smile like a man whose body will allow it. "You did." Mara looked up at him and then down at the floor where the blood had dried. She felt the achiness of her joints, the tremor of muscles that had done too much without permission. When she looked back up, the palace lights had warmed, as if morning had decided to happen inside the night. "We're not done," she said. "There are more of them, yes." His confirmation did not feel like a sentence. It felt like a plank in a bridge. She put her foot on it. "What do you need me to do?" He looked at her and saw not just the woman who had pulled him through stone, but a shape of the people he had never fully bothered to look at before. Not as a category, as a weight-bearing arch. He took a breath, steady. "Leave the palace, find your brother." Her face flickered even to the mention of the boy down in the dust. "The docks will be the next target. There are ships. We will hold here. If I live, it is because of you. If I do not, it is also because of you, because you brought me to a place where I could choose how to fall." "I'm not leaving you," she said. It came out more fierce than she intended. The palace widened around the word the way a mother widens around a baby's first cry. Somewhere, the broadcast found that word and looped it and made it into a song people would dance to in 9 sectors. "You must." He touched her shoulder, light and command. "Not as an order, as a weighing of needs. I have the palace now. They have not taken its voice. You must take its news." She realized then what he understood that she had not yet looked at. Her movement had been watched. The galaxy had seen a maid carry a king. It had seen a human and an alien fit into each other's balance in a way that made the floor under empires groan. She had become a story that could ransom a city if she spent it right. She had never been a story before. It made her dizzy. "There is a way to the docks through the hydro mines," she said, because in every conversation with power she'd learned to offer the next step instead of all of yourself. "I can get there faster than most because I know where the stone lies thinner." "Go," he said. "I will hold." She nodded. She hesitated. He lifted his hand. She took it. It felt different now, stronger, still cold, honest. He let it go. She turned, pulled the sled with her because it had become as much part of her as shoes, and went back into the tunnels. What followed in the hours to come felt like the second half of a storm. The first half is wind wanting, the second is wind deciding. Mara moved through the underworld like a pulse. The palace above fought room by room, trading space for time, time for lives, lives for something that might be counted later. The enemy realized too late that broadcasting your story gives your enemy a stage too. The feed became a war of angles. It showed soldiers lifting civilians. It showed pirates turned paramilitaries turned what exactly, looting and then hesitating under their leaders' orders. Because hesitation has a smell that even in war tastes like bread you can smell but cannot find. Mara reached the docks through a grate she had to pry with the edge of her shoe. The air smelled like heat and salt and engine oil. The ceiling here was sky, and it was torn by the lights of ships rising and dying. Dock workers ran like bodies of water in flood. Soldiers, hers and not, shouted language in the same rhythm. Get off the pad, get on the ship, get out of the line of fire. Somewhere a child cried and was not shushed because no one had a hand free. Mara, a voice cracked like a knuckle cracking. She turned and there he was, thin and dust-haired, his face older than it should be and his eyes still young. Jacob Keene, her brother. He ran to her and hit her with a hug that knocked her breath out of a place that had been empty for hours. He smelled like smoke and iron. He pushed her back and looked at her clothes and the blood on her hands. "What did you do?" She almost laughed. "Carried someone," she said. He looked at her like he was re-evaluating her size in the universe. He took her hand. "We have to go," he said. "They'll target the fuel lines next. If they go, the whole place." "I know," she said. He nodded like the older brother, although he was the younger, and that was how you know war is in the room. She looked around. A ship with a symbol she didn't know, 2 circles, linked, was loading. A woman at the foot of the ramp shouted names. Mara realized she was reading a list of anyone who could sew, anyone who could patch, anyone who could carry. She realized the ship belonged to no nation she recognized. It belonged to the on-the-ground union that appears when named nations forget to arrive, people who throw the ladder down and hold it with their bodies. Mara tugged Jacob toward the ship. "We help," she said. "We run," he said. "Both," she said simply, and in the compromise he heard the old Mara who had taught him to count to 13. He went with her. They lifted crates. They loaded people. They lifted more. The docks shook. The fuel lines didn't go but thought about it. An old man fell. Jacob lifted him. A child went quiet mid-scream and slept. A woman in a torn dress took a patch from Mara's hand and pressed it to her own skin without asking if it was sterile. And all the while, in some palace room, the emperor stood and refused to perform a magic trick. He used the tools of doors and decisions and breath, and he held. The galaxy watched. At first, it watched the fight the way it watches everything, for proof. It wanted data to dress its opinions. But there is a point in certain fights where bodies are not data. They are bodies. It is difficult to stay outside when something like the line between a maid and a king is being walked as if it is a plank to a ship whose captain is singing. Terms like pet and guest and overlord and rebel lost their crisp edges. The camera found hands and did not know what to do with them, so it broadcast them. Hands carrying, hands bleeding, Hands blocking blades meant for other chests. Whispers traveled. In some sectors, humans were indeed kept as soft labor. In others, they were citizens. In still others, they were newcomers too new to be anything else. The feed threaded all the truths and held them to a necklace bigger than anyone wanted. It showed Mara lifting an engine cover and Jacob crawling under to fix a thing, because a thing needed fixing. It showed the Emperor speaking into a mic drowned in static, ordering the release of prisoners whose crimes were disobedience rather than harm. It showed the leader of the invaders watching what he had made and realizing it was becoming a mirror. The day, if it could be called that under the torn night, bent. A quiet came that wasn't quiet but the space between the words a choir takes when it has sung itself hoarse and has one note left. On the docks, the Link Circle ship's captain shouted, "We have room for 3 more. After that we close. Pick the strongest. Pick the ones who can carry others." Mara looked around. She saw a boy with a broken arm. She saw a woman whose face was an exhausted moon. She saw a man who had fought hard and who would go back into any fight you asked him to because he didn't know how to stop. She grabbed them. She pushed them up the ramp. The captain grabbed her wrist. "You?" she asked. Mara shook her head and smiled without teeth. "I have more to carry." She did. In her pocket, her comm, a cheap thing with a patch that cut out during rain, buzzed. She pulled it out and saw an incoming message with the palace seal. She hesitated for a half-second because the palace had rarely messaged her for any reason other than to tell her what she had done wrong. She opened it. The Emperor's voice, not smooth now, not noble but worn, spoke. "Mara, if you hear this, I am alive. If you do not, I was alive. Either way, the southern gate. We push in 10 minutes. If you can open the airlocks at the docks for 3 minutes when the signal flares, it will pull the enemy's drones into a vacuum pocket and give us a breath at the gate. 10 minutes. She looked at Jacob. He raised his eyebrows in a pitch-perfect imitation of their mother. So, she looked at the panel where the airlock controls were. She looked at the enemy's men who had realized that the docks were being used to evacuate fighters, not just families, and had turned their attention to stopping that. She was so tired her tired had reached bone. She said, 10 minutes. What she did next became the part of the story fathers told their daughters when the daughters complained that their bodies were small. Size is a use, the fathers would say. It lets you slip through places larger bodies jam. She slipped now. She moved along the edge of crates and bodies and panic. She slid between 2 enemy soldiers who were arguing about who had more right to this kill. She scaled the back of a loader the way she had scaled the back of a sleeping elephant as a child when there was a circus on a planet long gone. She found the panel. It was locked to a voice she did not have, but she had hands. She pulled open its belly. She saw an array of wires arranged into what she had learned to read the way you read the lines on a palm, where life touches, where death. She remembered the Emperor's hand steady on the cradle. She remembered counting to 13 in the dark. She made a choice. She ripped out a green wire and twisted it to a red. She rerouted blue into blue because blue wanted blue. She did this with a calm that came from having lost everything and continued. The panel hummed. 5 minutes, said the Emperor's voice in her ear. It sounded like a man who had also opened something he had no right to open. Ready, she whispered, and the word fell into a channel that carried it like a river with room. Jacob had found a vantage between crates. He watched her with eyes that send a command stronger than any general's. Live. He waved a hand when an enemy soldier started toward her, a foolish beckoning like you would to a dog. The soldier turned and found a boy with a wrench and scowled. He stepped toward Jacob. Jacob turned and ran, the soldier after him, and that moment, stupid, brave, bought Mara 20 breaths. The sky tore. A signal flared, a streak of light so bright it made night cry out. Mara hit the panel's release. Air does not scream when it exits a room. It leaves like a friend called away by a greater duty. It left now in a rush of invisible. The drones that had been weaving at the dock spun, lost purchase, and were pulled into the vacuum pocket created by the sudden absence. Men reached for handholds with hands that had not been trained to. The Link Circle ship lifted its ramp and sealed, hugging atmosphere to its hull like a mother hugging a child. The enemy's drone Wave, aimed at the southern gate, stuttered. It stepped when it should have danced. A corridor of air opened that did not belong to them. At the southern gate, the Emperor stepped into that corridor as if onto a road between cornfields. He looked toward the palace gardens and somewhere beyond them, into the old city where children would be pretending not to be afraid. He lifted his hand not as a weapon but as a metronome. Soldiers with eyes of a dozen colors, skins of 100 textures, fell into step beside him. They did not shout, they walked. War's second half had decided itself. The enemy, confused, tried to recover and met the doctrine older than any of them. If you do not own the air, you do not own the ground. The palace, which had been holding its breath, exhaled. The gates opened. The enemy, who had imagined a slaughter, found a tide. Men can grieve tides and try to reason with them. They cannot hold them back with arguments. The leader, last seen by a camera falling back through a corridor still glittering with crown light, looked less like a narrator and more like a participant. It is a dangerous thing to be in a story. It does not care for your control. Mara's panel alarm shrieked. Systems reasserted. She pulled the wires apart and lied to the machine the way you lie to a child. Nothing happened. She slid down the loader and ran for Jacob. She found him where she knew he would be because you know where the load bearing is in your own house. He had a cut on his cheek and the bewildered smile of someone who has found himself in life when he had expected to find himself dying. "We go," she said. He grabbed her hand. They ran. Behind them the ship with the linked circles launched, steady, carrying a basket of lives. Another ship took its place. The dock became music, a percussion of feet, a brass of engines, the high flutes of cries. She ran and did not look back. She had learned something about looking back. On the palace steps, the Emperor stood. His side still bled under the mantle, a slow leak he would bind later. He looked into the camera that had chosen him and said, "To those who came here because of promises, I have only this to offer. Leave. To those who came to plunder, lay down your arms and leave or be escorted away without them. To those who live here, I say, our hands have been too proud to carry what needed carrying. We will learn. We will put away the word pet and pick up the word neighbor. We will tax the powerful, including me, and we will pay the weak with dignity. We begin with this. Open the gates between the refugee camp and the city. Tonight." A minister somewhere sucked his teeth. A soldier somewhere grinned. The Link Circle ship's captain, hearing the broadcast in her cockpit, said to her second, "About time." The enemy's leader watched and realized that somewhere he had mistaken destruction for change. And the galaxy, watching from couches, from bunks, from stools, from bridge chairs polished by generations of the same family, heard a word it had heard before in other mouths and did not believe until this one: begin. It is difficult to begin. It is more difficult to begin than to end. But sometimes a maid drags a king through stone, and a king returns from a cradle with his tool sharpened by pain, and that makes beginning feel as inevitable as tide. 2 days later, or perhaps 30 years, time grows elastic where relief lives. Mara walked the palace corridor again. She wore the same dress because the palace had no new ones to give. It had emptied its closets in the process of paying for its promises. She carried no tray. She carried a cloth in her waistband out of habit. She moved soft. The bell lilies had been replaced by ferns that didn't break because whoever ordered them decided nothing fragile should be asked to live here for a while. Outside the window, the sky had been repaired enough to hold a blue. People whom Mara would never meet were arguing about her in rooms she would not enter. They were calling her symbol and opportunity and dangerous precedent. She washed a bloodstain from a stair with a focus that made the stain into a doorway. People interviewed her brother. He did not mention the wrench. He said only, "She counts to 13, And because the galaxy loves a number, it turned 13 into a brand and a prayer. Distantly, the enemy's leader had had to go where failed men go, into a room with admitting light. He resigned from being the sort of man he had been to try a new sort. It rarely works, but sometimes. The emperor, who had killed people when he had to during the retaking of the gates, executed no one afterward. It cost him. It will cost him later. He made the cost public. Mara finished cleaning. She straightened and turned. The emperor was there. He moved less like glass now and more like water. The mantle did not tines or glitter. It seemed to have learned humility and pain. He held no scepter. He looked at her with a complicated expression that you could not buy. He said, "There are audiences who want to see you. There are stairs that want to be clean," she said, and it was not insolence, it was reality. He inclined his head as if she had given him a new way to say please. "After the stairs," he said. "After the kitchens," she said, because those had become a quiet war zone of their own. He nodded again. He did not order her to do anything. He did not give her money. He did not abolish all debts with a signature on a paper because he had learned in the last days how paper ignores the mind of stone. He did two things that mattered. He told the accountants to write Mara Keene, human, into the ledger of those owed and owed to, and he told the men in the communications tower to cut feeds that used her face to sell other wars. It didn't work entirely because nothing does. It made a beginning. At sunset, which had been adjusted to aftershock time and arrived when the city could use it, he asked her to walk with him in the gardens. She said yes because the gardens are a good place to breathe. They walked slowly. The bell lilies had been replanted among armor shards. The fountains had debris in their mouths and sang over it. Children were there with their mothers because the command "open the gates" had made a path to grass worn smooth in a day. They said little. He did not ask her to repeat the song. She did not ask him to justify empires. They arrived at a bench where the keeper of bones used to sit and keep bones. It was empty because there was no keeper anymore. The emperor sat. Mara stood. He said, "There was a moment when you told me to breathe, and I did." She did not say yes. She said, "You were heavy." He smiled properly this time. "I am learning to be lighter." "It will make you harder to carry when necessary," she said, which was a joke in the way minors tell jokes. He nodded because he knew. He looked out at the children. He said half to himself, "They will grow up watching the story of a human who carried a king. What will that do?" "It will teach them," she said, "that anyone can be the load-bearing and that power ought to be very polite to those who carry it." He looked at her again then, but not as a symbol. As a person with a spine and a job and a way of mapping the world like a miner does. He knew if he asked her to join a council she would say no. She had no time for tables. He knew if he offered her a title she would drop it down a stairwell and keep walking. He asked instead, "If you had a promise you wanted me to keep today, not in the future, what would it be?" She didn't think. "No more pets," she said flatly. "No more debt that outlives the body, and a working ventilation system in the dock so my brother doesn't choke." He nodded. He stood. "Done," he said. She did not thank him. He went away to make it true because he understood now that a promise is a sled you have to lean into, not a word you say into a microphone. The galaxy kept watching for a while, then stopped, because it always stops unless you violence it into looking. It turned to other stories. But it remembered the way a body remembers a scar. You don't look at it, but it tells you where the bone broke when the weather changes. In some worlds, mothers sang the mantle song without knowing the words, humming a fourth and a careful third. In others, boys with cruel shoulders found that women looked at them differently if they spat on floors. In still others, governors learned to count to 13 in crises and were not embarrassed to admit where they learned it. The docks got air. The debt rolls got thinner. The palace got older. In the kitchens, a new head cook with a laugh like a rope hitting water taught Mara to make a soup that tasted like getting a second chance. She learned. She learned, too, to carry less because less needed carrying. That was maybe the work of a life. She did not find contentment. She found a rhythm. It included Jacob and stairs and stone, and sometimes, rarely, laughing with the emperor about things that would not survive laughter outside that garden. Once, not long after the gates retaking, Mara walked the long central corridor and found herself in that vestibule again. She paused by a window where she had seen the hairline fracture race along the wall. Someone had repaired it poorly. She touched the rough place and the wall's memory came into her finger. She thought, I was here. She thought without pride, I will always be someone who was here. The thought steadied rather than enlarged her. She went on. That night, the palace held a dinner where some of the people ate and some of them pretended to, because politics eats more than food. Mara was not invited and would not have gone. Outside, on screens in bars and living rooms and officer training halls, a clip replayed. A small human lifting a larger alien, a crown dim as a fading ember. People watched for the 100th time and discovered a new detail in the curve of the arm or the tilt of the head, and said to each other in new ways, "Look, look." In a room above the gardens, the emperor stood alone and looked at his hands. He could call it a coronation, this thing that had happened not with fanfare but with a girl's voice singing dust and light together. He did not. He called it a breath. He took another. He thought of Mara somewhere below counting steps and counted with her. Tomorrow would bring trouble. The leader of the invaders would return not with blades this time but with lawyers, and that fight would be uglier. The corps of ministers would find ways to tell the emperor no. People would say he had gone soft. People would say he had gone hard. Children would chase each other under bell lilies and know that running makes you free only while you are running. The palace would need sweeping. The docks would need repair. In the morning, standing on her steps, Mara would lift her bucket and pick up her cloth and begin. A neighbor would say, "You could be on a council, you know." She would say, "Maybe later." Jacob would say, "You could be a legend," and she would say, "Legends don't scrub corners." But as she scrubbed, strangers would stop to watch her with a quiet that was not worship but respect, and some of them would bend and take up rags because respect without labor is theater, and theater is useless unless you are starving and words are bread. The day would be ordinary, and in that ordinariness the rumor of the extraordinary would hide, and the hiding would be itself an act of endurance. The palace would smell of clean stone. The galaxy would go on. Mara would hum under her breath without realizing it, a melody that went up on the fourth and down like a careful foot on a rung. When Jacob coughed, the vents would pull the dust away and return air. People would be tired. And somewhere, hidden in the settling dust of history, a sentence would hang, waiting to be spoken whenever somebody needed it. It would not be glorious. It would not end a war in a blaze. It would be what a body told itself when it had to push a sled and a king and a day to its new place. It would be that humility's battle cry, that small and necessary oath, and that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.